very privileged to have with us Dr. Daniel Field. Dr. Field joined the Department of Earth Sciences at Cambridge as a university lecturer in 2018, received a UK Research and Innovation Future Leader Fellowship in 2019, and joined the University Museum of Zoology in 2021. He is also currently an assistant professor in vertebrate paleontology, fellow and director of studies in earth sciences at Christ College, and a Strickland curator of ornithology at the University of Cambridge Museum of Zoology. With that, can we welcome Dr. Daniel Field, please?
Thanks very much, Keen. It's exciting to speak to this group. Thanks very much for the invitation. This is my first CUSS experience, so thanks very much for having me. I didn't realize how amusing an acronym it actually was until I put it on my slide there. I'll try to watch my mouth. Yeah, as Keen kind of implied, I'm very interested in the evolution of birds. So I'm the curator of ornithology over at the Museum of Zoology. If you've never been there, it's free, so come on, check it out. It's a great resource here at the university, and it's located over on the new museum site, adjacent to the zoology department. So the reason I find birds to be such an interesting group to study as an evolutionary biologist is because birds are so incredibly diverse and varied in their colors and their forms and their lifestyles. So for anybody interested in evolutionary biology, birds provide a magnificent case study that we can use to try to understand how and where and when this incredible diversity and disparity has come to be. So this is just a tiny smattering of living bird diversity. Birds today are represented by over 11,000 living species. So what you're looking at is roughly 200 living representatives sampled across basically the living bird family tree, representing the 200 major branches of that bird family tree. So as an evolutionary biologist, I'm interested in trying to understand how this incredible diversity, these 11,000 living species, have evolved, as well as trying to understand how the characteristic features that make birds unique among living vertebrate animals have come to be. So primarily, I try to address these questions using fossils. So I'm a vertebrate paleontologist, and I'm interested in the sort of information that the fossil record can provide in terms of telling us exactly how and when various evolutionary transitions have come to be. So this is an example of some of the work that we do in my lab. This is a brand new three-dimensional reconstruction of a very old fossil. This is an early relative of birds from about 86 million years ago called Ichthyornis. And the PhD student of mine who's just finishing up his dissertation now has focused on describing this anatomy in more detail than has ever been provided before, which provides us with new insight into how characteristic features that we associate with modern birds have arisen. So one interesting thing about Ichthyornis that fossils can provide us with is information on how and when the characteristic toothless beak of living birds arose. So of course, no living birds exhibit teeth, but if you look at the jaws of Ichthyornis, they're full of sharp, pointy teeth retained from the dinosaurian ancestors of birds. So one very interesting piece of information that Ichthyornis provides us with is this toothless portion of the upper beak over here. So this turns out to be the earliest known manifestation of a toothless upper bill that we see in bird evolutionary history. So this fossil tells us that by 86 million years ago, the toothless beak of modern birds had arisen at least in an incipient form, and then teeth were subsequently lost from the posterior portion of the upper jaw and the entire lower jaw. So obviously, working with fossils is one thing, but a lot of people in my research group and myself, we are ornithologists, and so we like to spend a lot of time in the field where we observe and we photograph living birds. And the reason we do this is basically the same rationale that any bird watcher will provide. Birds are fascinating, and they're one of the few living groups of living vertebrate animals that allow us to observe a considerable diversity of forms without even trying very hard. So if you went on a walk over on Cofen, just a couple hundred meters away from here, in the middle of the day, you'd easily be able to see over a dozen species of birds, which really isn't the case for any other major group of vertebrate animals. Living mammals are much more difficult to observe, and in this part of the world at least, cold-blooded reptiles like crocodilians, lizards, snakes, you're not going to see those on a walk around Cofen. So birds are fascinating because they provide us with some of the most observable examples of living vertebrate diversity in the world. But for an evolutionary biologist, spending time in the field observing and photographing birds is a fascinating thing to do as well. Because by learning more about the actual biology of these organisms, we can start to come up with interesting hypotheses that we can then try to test in the lab to try to explain how those interesting aspects of bird biology have arisen. So in our research group, we really combine insights from fossils and living birds all the time. And for anybody who's actually interested in bird evolution specifically, the last 15 years or so have been an extremely exciting time. Because through a combination of advances in our ability to sequence huge amounts of genomic information, as well as computational advances that actually allow us to analyze these enormous genomic data sets, we've made huge progress in terms of our understanding of how the major groups of living birds are related to one another. Essentially, over the last 15 years or so, we've begun to reconstruct the bird family tree, which has been a major goal of ornithologists for over 150 years. And it's only now that we've actually been able to do it in a reasonably reliable way. So this is an image of a bird family tree that we put forward 6 years ago now. It's getting a little bit old, but it remains the most comprehensive picture of the living bird tree of life that has been put forward so far. So this is a family tree bringing together 200 representatives of living birds sampled from across the entire living bird tree of life. So each one of those branches represents a group which is populated by many more than one living species in the present day. But the family tree itself kind of provides us with a framework for understanding how the major groups of living birds are related to one another. So obviously branches sharing a more recent common ancestor with one another are more closely related to each other than they are to any other branches on the tree of life. Now, this kind of evolutionary framework is extremely useful for evolutionary biologists for lots of reasons. First of all, and most simply, it does tell us how these groups are related to one another. It gives us a sense of which groups share a more recent common ancestor with one another than they do with anything else, which gives us a much clearer understanding of how this living diversity has actually arisen. But of course, having this kind of evolutionary framework also allows us to think about how and when and where on this tree of life important evolutionary transitions actually occurred. So for example, we know that all living birds share feathers as an ancestral feature. So, very simple example, feathers must have arisen prior to the last common ancestor of all living birds, and that feature would have been inherited by all living birds. By contrast, I'm not sure. So here, this big clade in blue, this big group in blue, that's essentially an aquatic bird radiation. So it brings together many different groups of aquatic birds, including penguins and albatrosses and storks and herons. And obviously, the last common ancestor of this group of blue itself would have been an aquatic bird, which tells us that a transition to an aquatic lifestyle probably took place somewhere right around here, prior to the origin of this entire blue group. So this kind of intellectual framework is very useful for studying actual evolutionary transitions itself, but this kind of family tree actually provides us with much more information than just telling us how the different groups of birds are related to one another. Because the vertical axis of this tree is actually scaled to time. And so you can't really see it given the resolution of the projector and how far away you are, but the vertical axis of this tree is scaled to a geological time scale. And the way that's done is by incorporating fossils into our analyses. So if we have a fossil representative of this group in yellow here, and that fossil is, let's say, 50 million years old, that fossil tells us minimally that the evolutionary divergence between that yellow group and that yellow group's closest living relatives must have taken place by 50 million years ago. So that logic is very simple, and by combining lots of different fossils representing different groups across the tree of life, with estimates of rates of genetic change that we obtain from the genomic data sets that were used to build this tree, we can estimate when in Earth history important evolutionary divergences between different groups actually took place. So if we keep that sort of vertical timescale of this tree in mind, and we ask when in Earth history the most recent common ancestor of all living birds probably lived, we obtain an estimate of about 75 million years ago. So this is an interesting point in Earth history. 75 million years ago, we're back in the Cretaceous period. So we're back at the end of the age of dinosaurs, which is a period that ended about 66 million years ago when a giant asteroid struck the Earth. So if we keep this sort of vertical axis of the tree in mind and think about interesting temporal patterns that might jump out at us when we look at the structure of this family tree, a really interesting pattern might actually jump out at us if we look down towards the bottom of the tree. So if you look in this portion of the tree in particular, it seems like several important evolutionary divergences near the base of the living bird family tree appear to have taken place in relatively rapid succession around one point in Earth history in particular. And that point in Earth history, I'll highlight it with a red line here. That point in Earth history corresponds to an event 66 million years ago that I just mentioned. This is the point in time when a giant asteroid struck the Earth and wiped out the giant dinosaurs. So I hope you like that animation, it took me really long. So this is one of the singularly most destructive events in the history of our entire planet. This caused something called the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event, one of the 5 most significant mass extinction events in the entire history of life on Earth, right? The entire 3+ billion-year-old history of life on Earth. And if we actually think about how destructive an event this was, we can put it into context using some relatively recent events. So I'm sure you remember the horrible news out of the port of Beirut, not from this past summer, but the summer before. There was an absolutely enormous explosion in the port which devastated much of the city, and the footage associated with that explosion was absolutely incredible. So this is one of the single most destructive human-caused explosions in history. In fact, I think it's the second most powerful non-nuclear explosion that humans have ever caused so far. And estimates of the energy unleashed by that explosion in the port of Beirut, which devastated an entire city just about, are equivalent to what would be expected if one were to detonate about 1,500 tons of TNT, right? This was a massive explosion. And if we compare the energy unleashed by that explosion in Beirut with estimates of the energy imparted onto the Earth by this late Cretaceous asteroid impact, I mean, we see that there's really no comparison. We're talking about, it's kind of hard to count the number of zeros. I think that works out to 100 trillion tons of TNT, which I'm not sure if I divided correctly. I don't do that much algebra actually these days, but it's about a factor of approximately 67 billion times when we think about how much energy was actually imparted on the planet by that latest Cretaceous asteroid impact. So, this was not a good time to be alive. And unsurprisingly, a huge amount of life on Earth disappeared when the asteroid struck. So what else can we actually say about this asteroid impact? It turns out that even though this took place 66.02 million years ago, this is something we can date actually really precisely with radiometric dating in the present day. Even though this happened a really long time ago, we know quite a lot about this asteroid impact. It's been studied really extensively, and estimates suggest that the actual bolide that struck the Earth 66 million years ago was somewhere between about 10 and 80 kilometers in diameter. This was quite a big lump of matter, and it was traveling quite quickly at about 20 kilometers per second when it made contact with the surface of the Earth. So one of the most interesting things about this latest Cretaceous asteroid impact is that the actual crater that it left on the surface of our planet is still detectable using geophysical imaging techniques. We can actually see the crater itself. So this crater is positioned right at the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, where it basically partially underlies the Gulf of Mexico and partially underlies the Yucatan Peninsula there. So this crater is 150 kilometers in diameter, and it's about 20 kilometers deep. So you can't just go to the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula and stand on the corner of this crater and sort of look out at it. This is a crater that has been covered up by 66 million years of sedimentation, but this crater is still there and it's still detectable using these sort of remote sensing techniques, where you can see it plunging through rocks of exactly the right age to correspond precisely in time to an impact 66 million years ago. So we're supposed to be talking about birds, but all of this sort of ties together eventually. Obviously, this was not a good time to be alive, whether you were a bird, a giant dinosaur, or any other kind of organism. But as an evolutionary biologist who's particularly interested in birds, learning about this mass extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period and thinking about how destructive the asteroid impact actually was, got me very interested in thinking a little bit about how that asteroid impact might have influenced the evolutionary history of birds. And the reason this is such an interesting question is because, of course, that asteroid impact is associated with the extinction of some of the most charismatic organisms to ever live. So all of the large dinosaurs appear to have gone extinct 66 million years ago. When the asteroid struck, things like T-Rex and Triceratops were still going strong. But we don't know nearly as much about how that asteroid impact influenced the subsequent evolutionary history of groups like birds. And so that's something I became very interested in trying to understand. In the present day, we think of canaries in the coal mine, right? We think of birds as being particularly sensitive indicators of environmental change. And so if that's actually true, one might expect birds to have been impacted quite severely by this asteroid impact. But actually, about 10 years ago, when we started thinking about this kind of question, it turned out we knew almost nothing about what happened to bird-like animals when that asteroid struck the Earth. We knew that there were several groups of bird-like organisms present in the fossil record from the late part of the Cretaceous, but we did not know exactly when those groups disappeared. So you're looking at a geological timescale over here on the left. This red line corresponds to the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary when that asteroid struck the Earth. And these groups over here, with the crosses next to them, that's how you denote an extinct group in the fossil record. So we knew that there were several extinct groups of bird-like forms, we should say more or less bird-like forms, present in the fossil record of the late Cretaceous period. But it wasn't clear whether these groups were even around when the asteroid struck in order to be affected by them. This group over here on the right, this group that we call Neornithes, that's what you can think of as modern birds. So that's the term we use to refer to the most recent common ancestor of all living birds and all of that ancestor's descendants. So of course we know that at least some lineages of early modern birds must have crossed that extinction horizon because we have birds alive today. So we became very interested in trying to understand when these archaic groups of Cretaceous sort of pre-modern birds actually disappeared. So we did something very simple, which took a lot of time, but we basically surveyed the entirety of the known bird fossil record from the late part of the Cretaceous period and the early part of the Cenozoic era, the interval following the asteroid impact. And we found that, in fact, all of these major lineages of archaic, pre-modern birds from the Cretaceous period appear to have extended all the way through the Cretaceous fossil record, up to the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, after which point they're never recovered in the fossil record again, suggesting pretty clearly that these groups of birds failed to persist across this mass extinction horizon. So this was the first really clear evidence to suggest that just like the large dinosaurs, just like the Mesozoic flying reptiles called pterosaurs, just like the giant marine reptiles called mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, it seems like many groups of birds actually were badly affected by this mass extinction event as well, and suggests that maybe we're actually pretty lucky to have had the ancestors of modern birds make it across this mass extinction event at all. So these results help clarify to us that yes, this mass extinction event does seem to have been an important event in the evolutionary history of birds, but it raised many more questions about how birds actually managed to survive that mass extinction event. So those are questions that we spent the last several years trying to piece together. First of all, we were interested in trying to understand which groups of birds were actually present at the end of the age of dinosaurs and were actually around to make it through that mass extinction event and eventually give rise to what we think of as living bird diversity in the present day. We also became interested in trying to understand how those groups survived. Obviously, these pre-modern birds over here, maybe other than retaining some ancestral features like teeth, were for most intents and purposes quite bird-like. So what sort of advantages might the ancestors of living birds have exhibited that would not have been shared with some of these groups that disappeared? And we also became very interested in trying to think about how this mass extinction event, how this catastrophic asteroid impact might have affected the kinds of habitats that birds are dependent upon, and how the persistence of those habitats through this very bleak interval in Earth history might have influenced the subsequent evolutionary history of birds. So we spent the last several years trying to come up with answers to some of these questions, and the first question turns out to be the easiest question to answer. Because in order to figure out which groups of birds were actually around at the end of the age of dinosaurs, in order to make it across this mass extinction event, we can turn to our time-calibrated family tree of birds. So all we really need to do is look down towards the bottom of our tree and ask which branches extend all the way down to the bottom and appear to be those branches that cross the mass extinction event. So we can sort of summarize those findings using a cartoon family tree over here, which gives us a sense of how the most important groups of living birds are related to one another. So this is a very sort of coarse breakdown of living bird diversity, but this is essentially what the living bird family tree looks like in its simplest form. So essentially, you've got this group over here called the Paleoenvironment, which is a group of birds that includes ostriches and their relatives. As you can see, it doesn't include very many living species. But these Paleoenvironments are the so-called sister taxon of all other living birds. That is to say, all other living birds are more closely related to one another than any of those living birds are to ostriches and their relatives. So right down here, you would have the last common ancestor of all living birds. So it seems like this ancestral lineage, which I'm now highlighting in yellow, this ancestral lineage that eventually gave rise to ostriches and their relatives, was one of the few lineages that appears to have persisted across the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. We also think that this next lineage highlighted in yellow was one of those lineages that survived as well. So this is the ancestral lineage that gave rise to a group of birds that we call Galo-Anseri. So Galo-Anseri is the group that unites chicken-like birds on one hand with duck-like birds on the other. If you look at a chicken and a duck, you might not think they look very similar to one another, but it turns out they're pretty closely related, although they did last share a common ancestor over 50 million years ago. But in the grand scheme of things, they're fairly closely related. So it seems like this ancestral lineage that eventually gave rise to chicken and ducks, that seems to have been another lineage that persisted across the mass extinction event. And finally, it looks like this final lineage over here, also shown in yellow, was also around to pass through that mass extinction event. And this is the ancestral lineage that eventually gave rise to the group that encompasses all living birds that are not ostrich-like birds and not chicken-like birds or duck-like birds. So this is a huge group that we call neo-aves. Well, you call them neo-aves if you're Canadian like me. I think in this country you might call them neo-aves or something much more refined sounding. But that group in the present day represents over 95% of living bird diversity. And it seems like just the ancestral lineage that eventually exploded and gave rise to that diversity was around 66 million years ago and snuck across that mass extinction event. So this provides us with a framework for thinking about which groups were actually around, what their ecologies might have been like, and how these groups might have survived when this horrific episode in Earth history actually took place. And that's what we're going to talk about subsequently. Just knowing about which groups were around 66 million years ago doesn't really tell us how those groups managed to survive. And this, of course, is a major question when you actually think about what kind of impact this asteroid would have caused to the planet. So all sorts of simulations, we'll talk about them a little more subsequently, but simulations and direct evidence from the sedimentological records suggest that in the immediate aftermath of the asteroid impact, global wildfires broke out. Basically, the Earth was a fireball for a brief period of time, which suggests that huge amounts of plant matter would have gone up in smoke very quickly. Probably not very good time to be around, especially if you're a large-bodied organism. And in fact, because the Late Cretaceous fossil record and the early Cenozoic fossil record are two of the intervals in Earth history that are best studied, we can say that it seems like nothing larger than maybe a small house cat survived this mass extinction event on land. And that's pretty striking, because obviously the late part of the Cretaceous period is an interval in Earth history that is famous for having been full of enormous animals, including things like T-Rex and Triceratops, but including lots of other gigantic Mesozoic forms as well. So it seems like nothing on land larger than 5 kilograms made it across this mass extinction event, and in the oceans, large-bodied things suffered dramatically as well. So there seems to be some evidence that being relatively small-bodied was very advantageous in the aftermath of this mass extinction event. So why would that be? Well, kind of makes sense, given that small-bodied organisms tend to have lower total metabolic requirements than large-bodied organisms do. If you're small, you don't need to eat as much as you do when you're big. So birds in general, I'm sure you'll agree, are not sort of famous for being enormous creatures. But it turns out that the bird fossils we know of from the end of the age of dinosaurs, those pre-modern birds, were relatively large-bodied organisms. And the ancestral lineages of modern birds we think survived that mass extinction event appear to have been significantly smaller. So this is consistent with a pattern that's known as the Lilliput effect. It's kind of a humorous name, but it describes a phenomenon whereby surviving lineages coming out of horrible mass extinction events tend to be smaller than their pre-extinction antecedents. And the most obvious mechanism for driving that reduction in size seems to be the fact that small-bodied things may be more likely to survive when the going gets rough because they need to eat less, and they also tend to exhibit shorter generation times and might be able to build populations up more quickly in the aftermath of these mass extinction events. So this is a very complicated figure, but basically what this shows is the general pattern that we see where we compare body sizes of latest Cretaceous bird-like forms as estimated from direct fossil evidence with the body masses of surviving lineages making it through that mass extinction event. As you can see, there seems to be selection for reduced body size among those surviving lineages. So it seems like being small-bodied, if you were a bird, was a pretty useful strategy 66 million years ago, and maybe an important part of the story of why modern birds survived, but these kind of larger pre-modern forms did not. Another interesting question that we've been trying to address is the question of what happened to the kinds of habitats that birds are dependent upon when the asteroid struck the Earth 66 million years ago. So I mentioned that global wildfires apparently broke out in the immediate aftermath of that mass extinction event. Artists reconstruction here of a ground-dwelling bird fleeing that global forest fires. So what I'm showing up here, this is a simulation. It's not a new one, this is from about 2002. But what you're looking at, I guess you can't really see the time series ticking up down here. We're right now at 7 hours post-impact, 8 hours, 9 hours post-impact. So the idea is that in the hours post-impact, huge portions of the Earth's surface would have been heated above the temperature at which vegetation will spontaneously combust, suggesting that enormous portions of the planet essentially would have gone up in flames. And that includes forests. So forests were diverse and abundant and globally widespread towards the end of the age of dinosaurs, but paleobotanical evidence, that is to say evidence from fossil plants and fossil pollen, suggests that for an interval of several hundred to several thousand years following the mass extinction event, following the asteroid impact itself, global forests were devastated. And that is quite fascinating because, as you probably know, a lot of living birds live in trees. And in fact, the most diverse and globally widespread group of pre-modern birds that was on the planet during the age of dinosaurs was a group called the enantiornithines, which means the opposite birds. You can say opposite birds because it's easier to say. So these opposite birds really were diverse and widespread. There are over 100 different kinds of opposite birds that are known, and they're known from all different continents. And the thing about opposite birds is that almost all of these known forms exhibited feet that look like this. So feet which are characterized by elongated and reversed hind toes and strongly recurved claws. So those are interesting features for anybody who's familiar with sort of modern bird anatomy. Those are features that are strongly associated with perching in trees. So it was always assumed that this group, this very diverse, globally widespread group called opposite birds, were denizens of the forest. And it was always a bit of a mystery as to why these opposite birds disappear abruptly when the asteroid strikes, whereas the ancestors of modern birds survive. But if it's actually true that enantiornithines, these opposite birds, were predominantly dependent on living in trees, then it may be that global wildfires and darkness that ensued from the asteroid impact may have been related to their demise. That, of course, doesn't tell us why and how the ancestors of modern birds made it through this mass extinction event. But that's a question that we can gain some insight into when we take our living bird family tree and start to use it in an analytical framework. So this circular diagram here, it's kind of a fancy version of our bird family tree. It's just that same tree arranged in a circle because it looks kind of cool. And at the tips of the tree, you have all of your, at the tips of the tree, you have all of your living bird species. I'll try not to click on the slide this time. So you can categorize all of the living species united in this tree according to their ecological habits in the present day. So obviously a lot of birds live in trees, and those lineages that are predominantly arboreal or tree-dwelling are shown in green. But equally, a lot of living bird groups spend most of their time on the ground. So there are lineages here in brown. Those are predominantly ground-dwelling groups. You can't really see on this projector, but there are also gray lineages. So those are lineages that spend a lot of their time in the trees, but also a lot of their time on the ground. Think about something like starling or a green woodpecker or something like that, if you know your Cambridge birds. So you can use those ecological scores in the context of this phylogeny to perform a statistical analysis that attempts to infer the most likely ecological state of the deepest portions within the tree. So we can ask, what kind of ecology do we think the most recent common ancestor of all living birds probably exhibited? And what sort of ecologies might other deep ancestral populations within the living bird family tree have exhibited either immediately before or immediately after this mass extinction event. And when we perform these kinds of statistical analyses, we infer with very strong statistical support that the last common ancestor of all living birds almost certainly would have been a ground-dwelling bird. And what's interesting about that is that it seems like the earliest inferred transitions to arboreality seem to be transitions that took place after the mass extinction event, after global forests would have recovered from the devastation caused by these short-term wildfires and longer-term darkness and cold. So it seems like the only lineages of birds to make it through this mass extinction event were relatively small-bodied, ground-dwelling birds. So this work that we've done over the last several years has provided us with sort of three key hypotheses about what we think birds might have been up to 66 million years ago when the asteroid struck. Three key ideas that might help us understand how and why birds managed to survive this mass extinction event that wiped out their dinosaurian cousins. The first of those hypotheses is that modern bird evolutionary history was really only in its infancy when the asteroid struck. It seems like the last common ancestor of all living birds lived about 75 million years ago, and only the very deepest branches within the bird family tree appear to have crossed that mass extinction horizon. We also think that any surviving lineages of modern birds would have been relatively small-bodied organisms, consistent with this hypothesis of a Lilliput effect, selecting for smaller-bodied organisms at the expense of larger-bodied organisms when the going gets tough during mass extinction events. And we also infer that the last common ancestor of living birds, and in fact all surviving lineages of birds that made it across that mass extinction event, were probably predominantly non-tree dwelling organisms. So these are all kind of fun ideas, but of course they're all inferences. What would be really useful would be actual direct paleontological evidence of early modern birds from the end of the age of dinosaurs that might provide us with some kind of check, some kind of test in order to address whether these hypotheses actually seem to be on the right track. But there's a problem with that. And the problem is that the modern bird fossil record from the end of the age of dinosaurs is extremely sparse. And in fact, up till a couple of years ago, there were exactly 0 consistently, strongly supported fossil representatives of modern birds known from the age of dinosaurs. But like I said, that was up till a couple of years ago, and that's what I want to talk to you about for the rest of this presentation. And I'm going to be talking about what I'm sure you'll agree is probably the least impressive looking fossil ever unearthed. This really is a pretty horrible looking fossil, and that's a 20-pence piece there, right? I mean, this is a small hunk of rock, and it really does not look very impressive at all. The only thing that's remotely interesting about it at first glance is the fact that there's clearly a broken bone poking out right here. So you're basically looking into the internal cavity of a shattered femur or shattered thigh bone from a bird. So you can tell it's a bird because the distal end of the femur is preserved there, and it looks very much like a bird bone. Of course, birds also have hollow bones, and you can tell it's hollow just by looking at the fact that it's shattered. So this is a fossil that I wasn't even particularly interested in. It's a fossil that's held at a museum in the Netherlands, in a small town called Maastricht, in the southern part of the Netherlands. And this fossil, other than coming from a bird, doesn't seem very interesting at all. But I went down to that museum because there's another bird fossil in that museum that I actually was interested in. So when I went down to visit, the curator there tried to convince me to take a look at this fossil as well, just in case it might be interesting. So I decided to humor him, and just to give you a sense in a little more detail of what this fossil actually looks like, here you can see it at slightly larger size. This is that shattered portion of the shaft of the femur up here. Here is that comparatively well-preserved portion of the bottom of the femur over here. And it sort of looks like there might be something interesting going on here, but it turns out those bones are not very interesting at all. They're sort of shattered fish bones. Kind of looks like crap. Anyway, if you take the fossil and rotate it around, this is a video. I was really trying to hold my hand still, and you can see I kind of failed. But anyway, if you rotate the fossil around, you'll see that actually on the bottom, if you scrape some of the rock away, there is another bird bone down there too. So this is another hollow limb bone. This one is called the tibia tarsus. So that's the shin bone of a bird. So okay, the bird fossil record from the end of the age of dinosaurs is pretty sparse. This fossil has at least 2 bones from a bird. We figured maybe it would actually be worth taking a closer look at this fossil, just in case. So the reason it seems so worthwhile to look at this very unpromising looking fossil is that it comes from an interesting place at an interesting time. So the fossil comes from right down here. It's about somewhere between 66.8 and 66.7 million years old. And it comes from a series of rocks called the Maastricht Formation. So the reason the Maastricht Formation is interesting is because it's the first locality ever discovered, so this is like hundreds of years ago, the first locality ever discovered that marks the very end of the age of dinosaurs. So the very, very, very last stage of the Cretaceous period is called the Maastrichtian, named for the Maastricht Formation, which is located close to the town of Maastricht in the Netherlands. So anyway, this is a bird fossil that comes from the Maastricht Formation. You can see it's right here on the border of the Netherlands and Belgium. That's where the quarry where this fossil came from is located, and that's kind of neat for us because that quarry is not so far away. So if this fossil turned out to be interesting, we figured maybe that would be kind of cool because it might suggest that this part of the world actually played an important role in the early evolutionary history of birds, but that was getting way ahead of ourselves. So what we decided to do was take a much closer look at that unimpressive looking fossil. And here at Cambridge, we're pretty lucky because in the basement of the Museum of Zoology, we've got a really high resolution micro CT scanner. So this CT scanning facility allows us to generate 3-dimensional anatomical images at resolutions up to 3 microns. So for those of you who aren't zoologists who work on different aspects of science, 3 microns might not sound very impressive, but if you're a paleontologist, 3 microns is pretty good. So anyway, we took that fossil, popped it in the CT scanner, and generated a 3-dimensional model of the block. So once again, the model looks pretty horrible. It's just this kind of like fuzzy cloud of data. But if you kind of squint, you might be able to detect that this down here is the end of that femur. I guess you really can't see on that on the screen here, but that shin bone, that tibia tarsus, kind of cuts across the block right there. So the cool thing about the CT scan data is that you can threshold the scans in order to remove low density material. So in this scan, the bone is higher density than the rock, than the limestone that surrounds the fossil. So it's kind of a matter of course. You get data like this, you sort of toggle this little dial on the screen and you can digitally remove the low density rocks. So when I did that, this is December 2019 when this happened, we realized that inside the block, there was something really interesting. This is my PhD student Juan, who was there at the time. This obviously wasn't filmed when we first did this. When we first did this, we saw there was a skull inside the block. We lost our minds, we swore a lot. This was all filmed, subsequently. But inside the block, we have something truly extraordinary, which seems to be quite a nicely preserved skull from a bird from the end of the age of dinosaurs. So we went straight back to the CT scanner and scanned the specimen at much higher resolution, where we were able to actually take a close look at what the inside of this block is actually like. So bear in mind, this block is tiny. So that skull, which is completely invisible from the outside, is actually only about 1 millimeter beneath the surface of the rock. It's extraordinary. It still blows my mind that this lovely skull is positioned so close to the center of the rock that we didn't realize it. So after many painstaking months of digitally extracting the individual elements of the skull, we were able to sort of remove all of the rock blocking our view of the specimen, and we realized that the specimen was extraordinarily well preserved. So it's three-dimensional, as you can see. So other than, you know, being rainbow colored, everything that you're seeing here is as the skull actually is preserved inside the rock. So given that this is such a small skull, and given the exceptional state of preservation of the skull, I mean, bird bones are pretty lightweight and fragile, so it's very rare to have skulls preserved this well. This is actually one of the best preserved bird skulls of any age ever discovered, and it's also one of the oldest, so that's very interesting to us. So those rainbow colors correspond to the major architectural components of a bird skull. So in red, we have a bone called the premaxilla. That's the bone that in living birds composes most of the upper bill. The bones in yellow that bound the posterior portion of the nostrils, those are called the nasals. And those bones in pink at the top here, those are the frontals. That's basically the skull roof, the part that overlies the brain. And the lower jaws are here in blue. So the fact, I mean, in addition to that, we have all of these other kind of teeny tiny components of the skull which are almost never preserved in fossils, so that's kind of neat. So, okay, here's sort of another self-indulgent twirl, but what I really want to point out is that not only are these different components of the skull preserved, these components of the skull tell us something very important about what kind of bird this skull came from. So if you look at that premaxilla in red, you'll see that it's completely toothless. So when we looked at Ichthyornis at the beginning of this talk, we saw that Ichthyornis still retained teeth. And that's interesting because Ichthyornis is one of the closest known relatives we've ever discovered of modern birds from the age of dinosaurs, but it still retains teeth. So the fact that this fossil doesn't have any teeth suggests that maybe it's actually an early representative of modern birds themselves. This fossil also has fused lower jaws. So all living birds have a left jaw and a right jaw that come together that are fused to form sort of a chin, like our lower jaw is. We've only got one bone because it fuses together. This is not the case in birds like Ichthyornis from the age of dinosaurs. They did not have fused lower jaws. Again, indicative of this potentially being a very early modern bird. The lower jaw also is lacking a bone called the coronoid bone, which is something that we see in birds like Ichthyornis. So all of these features suggested to us that what we were actually looking at here might be a very early representative of the modern bird group, a very early representative of this group that we call Neornithes. But when we actually look even closer at the anatomy of the skull, we start to see that not only does it seem like a modern bird, it seems like we can actually identify what group of living birds this skull is actually most closely related to. So for example, the premaxilla has this kind of posteriorly directed portion, kind of looks like a mustache. That's a feature that we only see in one group of birds in particular. The quadrate bone, which is the bone that connects the skull to the lower jaw, only has two condyles for connecting to the lower jaw, and that's something that we only see in the same group of living birds as well. And the lower jaw also has this sort of strongly projecting medial process, again, only seen in this particular subgroup of living birds. And that subgroup of living birds is Galoanseri. So Galoanseri is that group that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that unites chicken-like birds and duck-like birds in the present day. So all of these features suggested that we may not have only found the skull of a modern bird, we may have found a very early representative of this lineage, this major lineage of modern birds called Galoanseri. So it was very obvious that this was a new species, never been seen before. So we gave it the genus name Asteriornis. We thought this was appropriate. It's named for the Greek goddess Asteria, who was the goddess of falling stars. So close in time to the asteroid impact, falling stars. Asteria seemed like a good namesake, but even better. So Asteria, legend has it, transformed herself into a quail and threw herself into the sea to escape from Zeus. Zeus wasn't very nice. Quails are also Gallimincerians, and the fossil comes from marine sediments. So for all those reasons, we thought Asteria was the perfect person to name this fossil after. And in reference to the Maastricht Formation and the Maastrichtian stage of the Cretaceous, we named it Asteriornis maastrichtensis. So Galliminceri are a really interesting group of living birds because it unites chicken-like birds over here and duck-like birds, which I'm sure you'll agree don't really look similar to one another in the present day at all. But we know from analyses, phylogenetic analyses of the genomes of these birds, that they actually are closely related. However, we had never previously found a fossil that kind of provided insight into what very early representatives of this group might have been like. So if we look at the anatomy of the skull of chicken-like birds, we see that, I mean, again, it's not the highest resolution projector on Earth, but the general morphology of the fossil over here, and this is a turkey over here, are pretty similar. So the general shape of the bill is similar, the overall architecture of the bones of the face is quite similar. There's a very limited degree of fusion in the facial region of galliform birds, which is something we also see in the fossil. So the front half of the skull of this fossil looks very similar to what you would see in a living chicken-like bird. If we look at the skull of anseriforms, or duck-like birds, we see that actually the back of the skull is pretty similar to anseriforms. So we've got this strongly projecting post-orbital process, which is something we see over here on the fossil. We have this nice hourglass-shaped kind of profile of the skull and dorsal view, which is something that we see in living ducks. There are also several features of the jaw that's quite similar to what we see in living ducks. So altogether, this fossil kind of looks like what you would get if you combined the front half of a chicken-like bird skull with the back half of a duck-like bird skull. So on the basis of those features and features from the rest of the skeleton, we figured that this fossil was probably close to the last common ancestor shared by living chicken-like birds and living duck-like birds. So we're all familiar with chickens and turkeys and ducks, but actually these are pretty diverse modern groups. In the present day, there are 300 different species of living chicken-like birds and almost 200 living species of ducks, geese, and swans. So these are diverse living groups. They're really interesting in their own right, and the fossil seems to be an early representative of this lineage. So what kind of information does this fossil actually provide us with, which might yield some insight into whether we were on the right track with these three major hypotheses about what was going on in bird evolutionary history at the end of the age of dinosaurs? Well, first of all, we can ask whether the fossil is consistent with bird evolutionary history only really being in its earliest stages when the asteroid struck the Earth. If we ask where Galliminceri is positioned on our bird tree of life over here, we can see that this group that unites turkeys and ducks, the Galliminceri, is in fact one of the three very deepest lineages on the entire bird tree of life. So even before we found this fossil, we would have expected an ancestral representative of the chicken-like and duck-like bird group to have been present towards the end of the age of dinosaurs. So the actual phylogenetic position, I've just superimposed the position of that KPG boundary, that's where the asteroid struck. So you can see that ancestral lineage eventually giving rise to duck-like birds and chicken-like birds seems to be one of the few lineages that actually did cross the KPG boundary. And we think evolutionarily, this skull probably would have sat on this evolutionary tree somewhere right around there. Was the fossil small? Well, I'm sure you'll agree that chickens and ducks are not the absolute smallest birds you might be able to think of. They're relatively large among living birds, and of course there are some living species of duck-like birds like the mute swan that we're familiar with seeing on the cam that are absolutely enormous. They average over 12 kilograms. But on the other side of the Gallimincerian size spectrum, we've got some pretty small birds. So another good Cambridge bird is this over here. This is a green-winged teal, which averages about 395 grams typically. And gray partridges, which you can also see around Cambridge, also average about 395 grams. So the reason that body size is significant is because by scaling it through scaling equations based on the diameter of the hind limb bones of Asteroid. It actually seems like Asteroid probably weighed somewhere in the ballpark of 395 grams itself. So for a Galoanceran, Asteroid actually would have been quite small body, and 395 grams is well below the estimated masses of bird-like forms that we know of from the late part of the Cretaceous that did not survive. So to give you a clearer sense of how big the skull of Asteroid actually is, this is a picture of me holding a 3D printed prototype of the skull at 100%. So I'm not a giant, it's just a pretty small skull. It's about 4 centimeters long. I actually have a 3D print in my bag. I just setting up for a practical tomorrow. If anybody's interested, I can show you. Okay, was it ground dwelling? Well, we can't go back in time to 66.75 million years to see what Asteroid was doing ecologically. But you can actually draw some pretty robust inferences about the ecology of the bird from its hind limb proportions. This may be not too surprising when you think about it. Birds that spend a lot of time perching in trees tend to have relatively short legs. It keeps their center of mass low, so they're stable on a branch. They don't get blown away in the wind. Whereas predominantly ground-dwelling birds tend to have much longer legs. It increases their stride length, it helps them see up above the grass, that kind of thing. So obviously the hind limb portions of Asteroid were not very well preserved, but there's enough of them there for us to be able to estimate the minimum hind limb proportions of Asteroid. And even those fragments of bone show very clearly that the legs of Asteroid were quite slender and quite long, consistent with a ground-dwelling ecology for Asteroid. And that's kind of interesting because the paleoenvironment from which the actual fossil derives is consistent with Asteroid living close to a beach. So this is a near-shore marine environment, which is actually probably most similar in the present day to the beaches of Bahamas. So we're talking about a white sand beach, very lovely if you ignore the rotting mosasaurs on the shore. The Netherlands and Belgium would have been a fantastic place to visit in early December, 67 million years ago. Maybe not 66 million years ago, because then you have to worry about space rocks hitting you. So anyway, the fact that Asteroid seems to have been a relatively long, slender-legged bird is consistent with it potentially having prowled this ancient shoreline prior to the end of the Cretaceous period. So this is only one fossil, it's only one data point, but bird fossils from the end of the Cretaceous, at least modern bird fossils, are so sparse that this one data point actually provides us with really unique and important insight into what was going on in bird evolutionary history before the end of the age of dinosaurs. And it does indeed seem consistent with the idea that maybe only small-bodied representatives of the deepest portions of the living bird tree of life that were predominantly ground-dwelling made it through that mass extinction event. And as I mentioned, the fossil comes from a locality not too far away. So, border restrictions and Omicron and all that stuff notwithstanding, this is a place where you could actually go and hunt for fossils pretty easily. And that's exciting because it suggests that maybe even future discoveries of exciting early modern bird fossils might come from this part of the world. So there may well be implications for more exciting discoveries from these fossil beds. So with that, I'll wrap up by saying that, first of all, it was fantastic to have a chance to speak for the Society today, so thank you very much. And this is a beautiful artist's reconstruction of what Asteroid may well have looked like, prowling that late Cretaceous shoreline in Belgium 66.7 million years ago. You can see relatively slender, long legs, vaguely chicken-like bill, probably pretty useful for feeding on a whole variety of different food sources, seeds, insects, that kind of thing. Chickens aren't too picky. If you're actually, I've spoken for a really, really long time, but if you're interested in learning even more about the wonder chicken, or Asteroid, the fossil is actually on display right now at the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences. If you don't want to go there in person, you can check it out online, but Sedgwick Museum is located in the Earth Sciences Department. Admission is free, just like it is to the Zoology Museum and the Anthropology Museum and the Fitzwilliam Museum. We're really blessed with lots of amazing museums here. But I encourage you to come by, check out the display that we have, because it's probably the only chance you'll have to see the fossil here in Cambridge, because it's going back to the Netherlands on December 19th. So come and check it out in person. And I'll wrap up by saying thanks once again for listening, and I'd like to acknowledge my students who helped a huge amount with all of this work. So Juan Benito, who you saw a picture of before, and Albert Chen, both of them are finishing up their theses as we speak. They're supposed to submit in December, so wish them luck. John Yacht is my collaborator from the Netherlands, who kind of forced me to look at that ugly fossil in the first place, and Dan Sepka is a colleague of mine from the US. We work together on a lot of bird evolution stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Teal, for that very talk. Does anyone have any questions?
I never actually had this turned on, I realize now, so I'll just take it off. I hope you could hear me.
Any questions? Oh, if there isn't, can I ask one?
Sure.
I was wondering how flight comes into all of this. Like, what do you know about the flight ability?
Yeah, well, so the ancestors of birds acquired powered flying ability much earlier in the Cretaceous. So the earliest organism that we know of from the bird fossil record that is indicative of some limited degree of flying potential is a famous fossil called Archaeopteryx, and Archaeopteryx is about 115 million years old. So much, much older than this. So Archaeopteryx probably would not have been capable of sophisticated powered flight. Almost certainly it wouldn't have been able to fly in a sustained way over long distances. But even 150 million years ago, birds were experimenting with lightweight skeletons, asymmetrical feathers, and we're getting into the air. It seems like sophisticated powered flying ability is something that evolved significantly later in bird evolutionary history, but significantly later means about 120 million years ago. So by the time the asteroid struck, not only had birds been flying in a sophisticated way for about 60 million years, but birds had also, some lineages had independently lost the ability to fly. So just like we've got penguins and ostriches in the modern day that have gotten really large bodied and have lost the ability to fly, there are multiple lineages, independent lineages of Mesozoic bird-like forms that had already transitioned away from being able to fly by 66 million years ago.
I was wondering if there were any selection pressures on flight.
I think. Well, I'm certain there would have been. So flying ability would have been a huge advantage. Now, something, and I mean, I really do think that being able to fly would have allowed you to cover more distance, would potentially allow a surviving lineage of birds to find some sort of refuge, some portion of the earth that might not have been quite as charred as others. So I think, you know, being able to be small bodied, be ground dwelling, and being able to fly, those all probably were hugely advantageous. One thing that's interesting to point out is that I mentioned the ancestral lineage that eventually gave rise to ostriches and some other really large-bodied flightless birds. That lineage did survive the mass extinction event, but we actually know a fair bit about the early evolutionary history of that lineage, and we know that the evolution of large body size and flightlessness seems to have happened much later. So actually, ancestrally, ostriches and their relatives would have been pretty small-bodied, ground-dwelling, flying birds. So those ancestral ostrich-like forms that survived the mass extinction event would have been capable of flight. So I think you're right. I think small body size, ground-dwelling habits, probably not being a very picky eater, and being able to fly, I think all of those parameters are quite important parts of the story.
And what do we know now about the ostrich? Aren't they some kind of an outlier of this hypothesis? It is quite big. And
oh, sure. So that's what I was saying. So ostriches in the present day are quite big, but actually ancestrally, that group we know from the fossil record was small and could fly. So ancestors, you know, these early relatives of ostriches were not large-bodied. So the actual ostrich-like birds that made it through that mass extinction event would have been small-bodied flying birds.
What kind of habitat did it go? I mean, to protect itself from these big temperature gradients or whatever. Was it caved by the sea or something? It doesn't seem that it went up in the mountains or something. Right?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's hard to say. So there are sort of theoretical papers out there that suggest maybe birds with burrowing habits, or birds that are aquatic divers, or birds of, you know, with ecologies of that sort may have been favored at the time. There's very little direct evidence to go on in order to support those sorts of hypotheses one way or another. I mean, it's really hard to say. It is a big planet after all, but we do know that this sort of global deforestation occurred on a global scale. So there's evidence of this deforestation from North America, across Eurasia, New Zealand, South America. So it seems like forests around the world were pretty much devastated. There have to have been places that were not as impacted as others. But I mean, the actual ecological habits of survivors, I have to say, are kind of difficult to fathom. I think the only way to really gain insight into that would be to once again be very lucky and find excellent fossil evidence of a surviving lineage of birds from within maybe a few thousand years of the mass extinction event, but that is kind of a tall order, given the fact that bird skeletons don't tend to fossilize particularly well. So in most terrestrial environments, fossil representatives of almost all groups of vertebrates, except for birds, can be relatively easy to find. So we don't have any bird fossils from the very earliest part of the Cenozoic era. So the earliest modern bird fossils we have are from a couple of million years after the mass extinction event. So by then, you know, lots of evolutionary change can happen over a couple of millions of years. But if we are successful in finding a bird fossil from the first few thousand years after mass extinction event, that would be incredible. And that's what my fieldwork is actually aiming to do. So I work at a fossil locality in Colorado that preserves a terrestrial environment from the first few thousand years post-extinction. We found a lot of amazing stuff. Turtles, mammals, lots of plants, but no birds so far. So, you know, fingers crossed that when we can get back there and start doing fieldwork again, we might actually find something that might answer your question.
So, sorry to ask something. So what about the atmospheric pollution that happened very close to the extinction event? What was it like?
Well, so there are multiple kinds of atmospheric pollution. So there's a huge amount of volcanism occurring on the planet when the asteroid struck. So there's a giant igneous province in India, which is outgassing huge amounts of sort of nasty pollutants in the millennia leading up to the asteroid impact and in the millennia following the asteroid impact. And there is a hypothesis that actually the asteroid impact itself may have triggered more severe volcanism in India at the time. So if you actually sort of think about the globe at the time, India is basically at the antipode from the Yucatan Peninsula. I don't think it's an absurd hypothesis that actually increased outgassing from the Deccan traps in India might have been related at some level to the impact itself. But nonetheless, there are a huge number of environmental pollutants at the time. The asteroid impact itself would have, you know, resulted in the discharge of huge amounts of ash and soot into the atmosphere. So simulations suggest that little bits of the Earth would have struck the moon, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the impact itself. And this atmospheric pollution is thought to have probably blocked out sunlight for a long period of time, up to several years. So even after kind of photosynthetic activity could have resumed after some of the soot had settled, paleo-environmental reconstructions, paleothermometric estimates of sea surface temperatures from immediately after mass extinction suggest that for decades, global surface temperatures were reduced. And that might have been from aerosols, sulfates, that kind of thing in the atmosphere, potentially increasing albedo, and basically making the Earth colder. So fireball, darkness, cold, and it would have been horrible. It's maybe not so surprising that very few groups actually made it through. And when you think about it, okay, fireball might explain some aspect of dinosaurian extinction on land or something, but what happened to those groups of vertebrates that disappeared in the oceans? What happened to the marine reptiles like mosasaurs, and plesiosaurs, which were really diverse and abundant at the time, it seems like photosynthetic shutdowns in the oceans from darkness and cold probably would have caused the collapse of marine food webs, which, I mean, if you're a top predator like a mosasaur or a plesiosaur, that probably is kind of incompatible with your long-term survival. So the only lineages of vertebrates that seem to do relatively okay across the mass extinction event are cold-blooded freshwater organisms, crocodilians and turtles. So they suffer extinction too, but there's several different taxa, several different species of crocodilians and turtles that do survive through the mass extinction event, maybe because they're able to go long periods of time without feeding, maybe because they're essentially able to go into torpor for long periods of time, and maybe because freshwater environments wouldn't have been as badly affected as marine environments if rotting vegetation and dead things might have allowed communities of sort of primary, sort of food webs to essentially be based on that sort of detritus in freshwater environments as opposed to primary productivity, which is necessary in the oceans to support those sorts of food webs. A lot of this is speculative, but the direct evidence of which lineages make it through versus which don't, that seems to be pretty robust.
Are there any similarities that you can think of in the kind of ancient past that compares to the selection pressure that we're currently putting birds under? Yeah, in human kind of activity.
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, obviously the Earth's getting warmer very quickly, and that's having a major impact on the potential geographic distributions of lots of birds. There are parallels through the early part of the Cenozoic when the Earth was really warm, right? I mean, you have to remember that the Earth is warming very rapidly right now, but we're essentially in an ice age. So, you know, the Earth's current climatic trajectory is terrifying and it's going to be horrible. But 55 million years ago, the Earth was really warm. We had tropical palm trees and crocodilians on northern Ellesmere Island, just to give you a sense of how different things were at the time. So there is kind of direct insight from the fossil record into what might happen to the geographic distributions of different groups of organisms in light of kind of Earth's current climatic trajectory. But I think much more relevant to your question is thinking about deforestation. How monoculture, how deforestation actually impacts bird diversity. And this is something that, I mean, there are lots of conservation biologists at Cambridge who can talk about this in much more detail than I can. Well, you cut down forests, I mean, bird diversity plummets, obviously. In the aftermath of the mass extinction event, right, I mean, we see a huge decline in the abundance of canopy-forming trees and a huge decline in the diversity of those canopy-forming trees. And I mean, look, lo and behold, we see major mass extinction of the sorts of organisms that are dependent on arboreal habits. So I think that this provides a fabulous sort of case study for thinking about, on a global scale, the perils of deforestation and associated sort of faunal links. I mean, it's not a pretty picture, and you know, the story is polluting less and slowing down deforestation. Those are going to be critical for maintaining, obviously, not only bird biodiversity in coming decades, centuries, and millennia, but I kind of think everything. So.
I think we have time for one last question. I think there's someone around there. Yeah.
No, so how do you think about the future of like bird evolution? Now you have, like, how about like we go from like present to like thousands of years later?
Yeah. Well, so like I think there are some predictions that you might be able to make about which birds might become distributed where as climate changes, but I think one of the really interesting kind of things that you become convinced of when you're a paleontologist, when you study these sorts of mass extinction events, is that very often the outcomes, well, some aspects of the outcomes might be predictable. For example, size selectivity seems to be something that we have a pretty good handle on. But very often the groups of organisms that sort of win or lose across these mass extinction events are extremely difficult to predict. And those opposite birds are a great example. So opposite birds really were diverse. There were about 100 taxa known from the Cretaceous, and they disappeared completely. Whereas modern birds, which were, I mean, at the very least, not very diverse at all at the end of the Cretaceous, happened to be the group that snuck across that mass extinction event. So I think randomness rules when these kinds of major ecological shakeups take place. I think there's a real role for chance in terms of structuring which organisms survive and which organisms don't. And that's a little bit troubling because, I mean, even if we had a clear picture of which organisms were definitely going to go extinct, I mean, that would be would be depressing in a way, but at least, you know, we'd be able to factor that into our kind of intellectual predictions about sort of where we're headed over the coming millennia. I'm not sure. I would suspect that they're going to be very difficult to predict outcomes of the kind of current trauma the natural world is facing. And yeah, not to be too bleak about it, but it's hard to say with much confidence. But you know, birds that are presently restricted to sort of tropical type environments, they might start moving north. And so if there's still bird watchers in eastern England several thousand years from now, they might have some nice tropical birds to actually look at.
Maybe once again,